1923, rescue ships arrived at Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean to find something extraordinary. Among the frozen wasteland and abandoned shelters, they discovered a young Inupiat woman who had done the impossible. She had survived alone in one of Earth's most hostile environments for nearly 2 years. Her name was Ada Blackjack, and she wasn't a trained explorer, a seasoned hunter, or a wilderness expert. She was a 23-year-old mother who had never fired a gun, never built a shelter, and had lived most of her life under the protection of missionaries in Nome, Alaska. Yet, what she accomplished in those 2 years of isolation would make her one of history's greatest survival stories. A story that was buried for decades because she was a woman, because she was indigenous, and because her incredible feat didn't fit the narrative that society wanted to tell. Ada Delatuck was born around 1898 in the remote village of Spruce Creek, Alaska, to an Inupiat family living in a world caught between ancient traditions and rapidly changing times. When she was young, her parents made a decision that would shape her entire life. They sent her to live with Methodist missionaries in Nome, where she would receive a Western education and learn to live in the white man's world. This decision stripped Ada of crucial survival skills that her ancestors had passed down for generations. While other Inupiat children learned to hunt, fish, and survive in the harsh Arctic environment, Ada learned to read, write, and embrace Christian values. She became fluent in English and adapted to a domesticated lifestyle that would later leave her woefully unprepared for what lay ahead. At 18, Ada married Jack Blackjack, a native man who promised her stability and love. Instead, she found herself trapped with an abusive husband who abandoned her and their young son, Bennett, leaving her to face poverty and desperation alone. Bennett was sickly, showing signs of tuberculosis, and Ada had no money for proper medical care or even basic necessities. In Nome during the early 1920s, opportunities for a single indigenous woman were virtually non-existent. Ada took whatever work she could find, cleaning, sewing, anything to earn a few dollars to keep her son alive. She was barely surviving when fate intervened in the form of Viljamur Stephenson, a famous Arctic explorer with a controversial plan. Stephenson was organizing an expedition to Wrangel Island, a remote piece of land in the Arctic Ocean between Alaska and Siberia. His goal was to establish a Canadian presence on the island and claim it for the British Empire. He needed people willing to spend a year or more in complete isolation, and he was specifically looking for indigenous people who he believed would naturally possess the skills needed to survive in the Arctic. The offer was $50 per month, more money than Ada had ever seen. For a desperate mother watching her child waste away from illness, it seemed like a miracle. She would join 4 men, 3 young Americans seeking adventure and 1 Inupiat man named Fred Maurer. Ada would serve as the expedition's seamstress and cook, tasks that seemed manageable for someone with her domestic training. What Stephenson didn't tell Ada, or perhaps didn't fully understand himself, was that Wrangel Island was one of the most desolate and dangerous places on Earth. He also failed to mention that she would be the only woman in the group, isolated with 4 men for months or potentially years, with no way to communicate with the outside world. In September 1921, Ada Blackjack found herself stepping onto the frozen shores of Wrangel Island, carrying with her a few personal belongings in hopes of earning enough money to save her son's life. The island stretched endlessly in all directions, a barren landscape of ice, rock, and howling wind that seemed to drain the warmth from everything it touched. The expedition members were woefully unprepared for what they faced. Alan Crawford, the 20-year-old leader, was full of enthusiasm but lacking in practical Arctic experience. Lorne Knight had some knowledge of the North, but was already showing signs of the scurvy that would later consume him. Milton Gallo was the expedition's photographer, more interested in documenting their adventure than understanding its dangers. Fred Maurer, the only other indigenous member, provided some stability, but even his experience couldn't compensate for their collective lack of preparation. Their supplies were inadequate from the start. Stephenson had promised that they could live off the land, hunting polar bears, seals, and Arctic foxes, What he hadn't considered was that none of them, including Ada, knew how to hunt effectively in these conditions. The island's wildlife was sparse and difficult to track, and their hunting efforts yielded little more than frustration and wasted ammunition. As winter approached, their situation became increasingly desperate. The ship that was supposed to return for them in 1922 never came. Ice conditions made navigation impossible, trapping them on the island for another winter. Their food supplies dwindled rapidly, and they were forced to ration everything down to the last crumb. The psychological pressure was enormous. 5 people trapped together in a tiny shelter, facing starvation and death, with no hope of rescue. Tensions ran high, and Ada, as the only woman and the only one who wasn't there by choice of adventure, often found herself caught in the middle of disputes between the men. The cold was relentless. Temperatures regularly dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and the wind created conditions that could kill an unprotected person in minutes. Their shelter, hastily constructed and poorly insulated, provided minimal protection against the Arctic fury. Ice formed inside their living space, and they huddled together for warmth while their breath created clouds in the frigid air. As 1922 dragged on with no sign of rescue, it became clear that their situation was hopeless unless something changed dramatically. The men made an increasingly desperate decision. 3 of them would leave the island and attempt to reach Siberia on foot, crossing the dangerous pack ice to seek help. They would leave Ada behind with Lauren Knight, who was becoming increasingly ill with scurvy, promising to return with a rescue party as soon as possible. On January 7, 1923, Ada Blackjack watched 3 figures disappear into the Arctic wasteland, leaving her alone with a dying man on one of the most isolated pieces of land on Earth. Alan Crawford, Milton Gala, and Fred Maurer had set out across the shifting pack ice toward Siberia, carrying minimal supplies and facing almost certain death. They promised Ada they would return with help within a few weeks. Those 3 men were never seen alive again. Left behind was Lauren Knight, ravaged by scurvy and growing weaker by the day. His gums had turned black, his teeth were loosening, and his body was consuming itself from the inside out. Ada, who had never cared for a seriously ill person, suddenly found herself responsible for keeping him alive while managing their dwindling supplies and maintaining their shelter in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The isolation was crushing. For months, the only sounds were the constant howling of Arctic wind, the occasional crack of shifting ice, and Knight's increasingly labored breathing. Ada had never experienced such complete solitude. No voices calling from neighboring houses, no sounds of civilization, nothing but the vast emptiness of the Arctic surrounding them. Knight's condition deteriorated rapidly. He became delirious, sometimes calling out for his mother, other times ranting about their situation. Ada tried to comfort him, sharing their meager food supplies and attempting to keep him warm, but she was fighting a losing battle against a disease she didn't understand with resources that were completely inadequate. On June 23, 1923, Lauren Knight died in Ada's arms. She was now completely alone on Wrangel Island, hundreds of miles from the nearest human being, with no means of communication and no hope of rescue. Most people would have given up at this point, but Ada was driven by something more powerful than fear: the desperate love of a mother who needed to survive to return to her sick child. The psychological impact of Knight's death was devastating. Ada had to dig his grave in the frozen ground using improvised tools, a task that took her several days of back-breaking labor. She said prayers over his body and marked his grave, then returned to her shelter to face the terrifying reality of complete isolation. What do you think you would have done in Ada's situation? Completely alone, with winter approaching again, and no survival training whatsoever? The story of what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about human resilience. With Knight's death, Ada Blackjack faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could give up, lie down in their shelter, and wait for death to take her. Or she could fight against impossible odds to survive in one of Earth's most hostile environments. Ada chose to fight. The woman who had never fired a gun suddenly had to become a hunter. The woman who had lived under the protection of missionaries and depended on others for survival had to become completely self-reliant. Most remarkably, She had to overcome not just the physical challenges of Arctic survival, but the crushing psychological weight of total isolation. Ada's first challenge was learning to hunt. Their ammunition was running dangerously low, and every shot had to count. She started with small game, Arctic foxes that came near their camp. Her first attempts were disasters. She missed shot after shot, wasting precious bullets while her food supplies dwindled. But Ada was desperate, and desperation became her teacher. Slowly, painfully, she began to improve. She learned to track animals in the snow, to predict their movements, to position herself for the best possible shot. She developed an almost supernatural patience, waiting hours in the bitter cold for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. When she finally began bringing down foxes consistently, it felt like a miracle, but hunting was only part of her challenge. Ada had to maintain their shelter through another brutal Arctic winter, alone. She learned to repair the roof when it leaked, to manage their small fire to conserve fuel while staying warm, to melt ice for drinking water. Every task that had been shared among 5 people now fell on her shoulders. The loneliness was perhaps her greatest enemy. She talked to herself constantly, sometimes having entire conversations out loud just to hear a human voice. She kept a diary, writing down her thoughts and fears, creating a record of her incredible ordeal. She even talked to the camp cat, Vic, who became her only companion and source of comfort during the endless dark months. Winter tested her resolve beyond imagination. Temperatures dropped to levels that could kill exposed skin in minutes. Blizzards raged for days, trapping her inside the cramped shelter with nothing but her own thoughts for company. Food was a constant worry. She had to calculate every meal, stretch every morsel, never knowing when she might get her next successful hunt. Ada also had to overcome her own cultural background. Raised by missionaries to be a proper Christian woman, she was now living in ways that challenged everything she had been taught. She was alone with a man's corpse. She was killing animals for food. She was living in conditions that would have horrified the religious community that raised her. Yet she persevered, driven by the memory of her son waiting for her in Nome. Spring brought new challenges. The ice began to shift and crack, creating dangerous conditions around the island. Ada had to learn to read the ice, to understand when it was safe to venture out for hunting, and when she needed to stay close to shore. She became an expert in Arctic survival through pure necessity and an indomitable will to live. By the summer of 1923, Ada Blackjack had transformed completely. The sheltered woman who had arrived on Wrangel Island was gone, replaced by someone harder, more capable, and infinitely stronger. She had learned not just to survive, but to thrive in conditions that would have killed most people within weeks. I want to thank you so much for staying with us through this incredible journey. What Ada accomplished next will leave you speechless, but her story also reveals a darker truth about how history treats its heroes. The best is yet to come. Now on, on August 20th, 1923, Ada Blackjack heard something she had not heard in over a year: human voices. A rescue ship had finally reached Wrangel Island, and the crew found a sight they could hardly believe. Emerging from a well-maintained shelter was a healthy, confident woman who had not only survived nearly 2 years alone in the Arctic, but had thrived. The rescue team expected to find bodies, or at best, a traumatized survivor barely clinging to life. Instead, they found Ada with a stockpile of fox furs she had hunted and prepared, detailed records of her experiences, and most remarkably, a calm demeanor that spoke of someone who had mastered her environment rather than merely endured it. Ada's first concern wasn't for herself. It was for her son Bennett back in Nome. She had survived this ordeal for one reason: to return to her child and provide him with the medical care he desperately needed. The money she had earned from the expedition, combined with her incredible story of survival, should have made her a celebrity and secured her family's future. But 1923 America wasn't ready for Ada Blackjack's story. She was a woman in an era when women were seen as inherently weak and dependent. She was indigenous at a time when Native Americans were viewed as primitive and inferior. Most damaging of all, her survival meant that 4 white men, including 3 Americans, had died while she lived. This didn't fit the narrative that society wanted to hear. The press coverage of her rescue was minimal and often dismissive. When her story was told at all, it focused on the tragic deaths of the 4 men rather than Ada's incredible feat of survival. Some accounts even suggested that she had somehow failed in her duty to care for Lorne Knight, despite the fact that she had nursed him through months of terminal illness with no medical training or proper supplies. Vilhjalmur Stefansson, the expedition's organizer, had his own reasons for downplaying Ada's story. The failed expedition reflected poorly on his planning and leadership. Rather than celebrating Ada's survival as a testament to human resilience, he treated her as an inconvenient reminder of his expedition's failure. Ada returned to Nome to find that her son Bennett's condition had worsened during her absence. The money she had earned helped provide some medical care, but it was too little, too late. Bennett died in 1924, just months after her return. The very reason she had risked everything in the Arctic was gone, leaving her to grapple with survivor's guilt and the question of whether her sacrifice had been worth it. For the rest of her life, Ada Blackjack remained largely silent about her experiences. She married again, had more children, and tried to live a quiet life. When reporters occasionally sought her out for interviews, she was reluctant to discuss her time on Wrangel Island. The trauma of isolation, the loss of her son, and society's dismissive attitude toward her achievement had left deep scars. It wasn't until decades later that historians began to recognize Ada Blackjack for what she truly was, one of the greatest survival stories in human history. Her diary entries, discovered years later, revealed the full extent of her ordeal and the remarkable strength she had shown. Modern survival experts who have studied her techniques acknowledge that what she accomplished should have been impossible. Ada died in 1983, having lived to see a gradual shift in how society viewed women and indigenous people. But she never received the recognition she deserved during her lifetime. She never got the book deals, the lecture tours, or the celebrity status that would have been showered on a white male survivor with the same story. Ada Blackjack's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about heroism, survival, and how history remembers its greatest achievements. Here is a woman who accomplished something that trained explorers and seasoned adventurers had failed to do. She survived alone in the Arctic for nearly 2 years, mastering skills she had never learned, overcoming challenges that would have broken most people. Yet her story was buried for decades, not because it wasn't remarkable, but because it didn't fit the expectations of her time. Society wasn't ready to accept that an indigenous woman could be stronger, more capable, and more resilient than the white men who had died around her. Ada's survival wasn't just about hunting foxes or maintaining shelter in impossible conditions. It was about the power of maternal love, the strength that comes from having something worth living for, and the incredible capacity of human beings to adapt and overcome when everything depends on it. Her story also reminds us how many other incredible achievements by women, by indigenous people, and by others outside the traditional power structure have been lost to history. How many Ada Blackjacks have there been whose stories were never told, whose achievements were never recognized? Today, Ada Blackjack is finally receiving the recognition she deserved all along. Her story has been the subject of books, documentaries, and academic studies. She's recognized as one of the greatest survival stories in history, a testament to human resilience and the power of determination. What do you think about Ada's incredible story? Could you have survived what she survived? And more importantly, what other amazing stories are still waiting to be discovered and told? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If Ada's story inspired you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of forgotten heroes and remarkable women who changed history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story of human triumph against impossible odds. And check out our next video about another incredible woman whose achievements were hidden by history. You won't believe what she accomplished. Ada Blackjack proved that heroism doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it's a young mother, alone in the Arctic, refusing to give up because someone back home needs her to survive.